Detroit had killers. Detroit had corruption. But Chester Wheeler Campbell sat at the center of both. Known as Dr. Death, Campbell was convicted of murder only once, yet police suspected him in killing after killing as the city descended into drug wars, compromised investigations, and silent cover-ups. He survived prison, outlasted witnesses, and kept records on everyone: criminals, cops, judges, and politicians alike. In 1975, a routine traffic stop exposed his secret world. What investigators found triggered years of legal chaos and revealed just how broken the system had become. This video tells the complete chronological story of Chester Wheeler Campbell, using only verified records, courtroom testimony, and contemporary reporting. Chester Wheeler Campbell was born in 1930 in Detroit, Michigan. He was the fourth of 6 children in a working-class family. When he was still in elementary school, his father died. The loss landed early and hard. His mother was left to raise 6 children on her own, keeping the household together without any public record of instability or criminal behavior among the rest of the family. By every available account, Campbell's siblings did not follow him into trouble. There are no known arrest records or criminal histories connected to them. That matters because it removes the idea that crime was inherited or unavoidable. What separated Campbell from the rest of the household was not environment alone, but choice, and those choices would begin showing themselves while he was still young. Detroit in the 1930s and 1940s was a place of opportunity and strain. Wartime manufacturing brought money and movement, but it also brought crowded neighborhoods, transient labor, and expanding underground economies. Numbers gambling thrived quietly, so did small-time theft. For a young man without a father and with limited supervision, the margins were thin. By his late teens, Campbell was already known to local police. The records show no dramatic violence at this stage, but they do show early property crimes, burglaries, break-ins, enough activity that his name and face became familiar to precinct officers. This was not a teenager slipping once, it was a pattern forming. By 1950, before he had turned 20, Campbell had accumulated multiple burglary charges. His criminal activity was serious enough that police displayed his photograph in station houses, a move reserved for repeat offenders who were expected to resurface. That detail tells you something important. Law enforcement did not see him as a kid experimenting with crime. They saw him as someone likely to escalate. There is no evidence in the record of mentorship from older criminals at this point. No mob ties, no organized backing. Campbell's early years show a man operating alone or in loose association, learning through repetition and consequence rather than instruction. He was not yet violent, but he was persistent. Chester Wheeler Campbell was no longer drifting on the edge of trouble. He had crossed into a rhythm of crime that brought him repeated contact with police. Not as a suspect who passed briefly through a holding cell, but as a name that kept reappearing in reports. His record during this period was built around burglary, break-ins, targeted thefts, crimes that required planning, patience, and familiarity with neighborhoods and routines. These were not impulsive acts. They showed a willingness to return to the same locations and take risks that suggested confidence rather than fear of arrest. One location in particular drew police attention. The F&F drug company became a recurring problem spot, and Campbell was identified as a prime suspect in multiple attempted burglaries there. These incidents were serious enough to land him short jail sentences, reinforcing a cycle that hardened rather than corrected him. Each arrest added to his familiarity with the system and stripped away whatever deterrent effect the consequences might have had. Detroit police knew him well by this point. His photograph was posted inside precinct stations, a quiet but significant marker. That step was taken when officers believed someone was likely to offend again and wanted immediate recognition if he crossed their path. Campbell had reached that threshold before he was 25 years old. What stands out in this period is the absence of violence, paired with the steady escalation of risk. He was not robbing empty buildings at random. He was probing businesses, returning to locations, and learning how quickly police responded and how witnesses behaved. This was an education built on repetition, mistakes, and observation. There is no indication in the record that Campbell held legitimate employment for any sustained period during these years. His income came from theft, and the scale of his activity suggested he was becoming comfortable relying on it. Police suspicion followed him, but so did a growing sense of capability. By mid-1955, Campbell had established himself as a known burglar with a reputation inside law enforcement circles. He was watched, recognized, and expected to resurface whenever a serious theft occurred. What police did not yet know was that he was moving beyond property crime. The line between burglary and armed robbery was thin. By the summer of that year, Campbell stepped over it, and once he did, there would be no way back. On July 1st, 1955, Chester Wheeler Campbell crossed a line that could not be erased. What had been a career built on burglary shifted into armed robbery, and within minutes into homicide. That day, Campbell was 24 years old. He was not acting alone. He was with two accomplices, David Green, also 24, and Watson Brooks, 23. The three men planned a robbery targeting what they believed was a numbers gambling operation operating out of an apartment on Lawton Street in Detroit. Numbers houses were known to keep cash on hand, and they were often protected quietly rather than openly, making them attractive targets for men willing to take risks. They prepared by covering their faces with handkerchiefs and arming themselves with pistols. This was not an impulsive theft. It was organized, deliberate, and meant to intimidate. When they arrived, they encountered Luther Mixon outside the building. Mixon was 43 years old. The confrontation happened on the street. Two of the men pulled their guns and demanded information about the owner of an expensive car parked nearby. Mixon refused to answer. His silence was met with violence. He was struck in the face with a pistol and knocked to the ground. As he tried to stand back up, one of the attackers fired a shot at close range. The bullet struck Mixon in the face. The gunshot did not end the robbery. While Mixon lay bleeding in the street, the men forced their way into the apartment above the numbers operation. Inside were four people: John Jackson, Julia Jackson, Roosevelt Williams, and Emmett Carter. They were beaten, threatened, and robbed. The attackers took approximately $420 in total. Some of that money was taken directly from Mixon's pockets as he lay wounded outside. Mixon was transported to the hospital, where he later died from the gunshot wound. The sequence of events mattered. This was not a robbery interrupted by panic. It continued after the shooting. The violence was not followed by retreat, but by escalation. That detail would later weigh heavily in court. For Campbell, the crime marked a decisive moment. His past burglaries had kept him on police radar. This act placed him at the center of a murder investigation. The man police had expected to resurface in theft cases had now become something else entirely. By the end of that night, one man was dead, four others were traumatized, and Campbell had committed the only homicide he would ever be convicted of, an act that would define the rest of his life. The murder of Luther Mixon set off an investigation that moved quickly, but not cleanly. Detroit police already knew Chester Wheeler Campbell by sight, and that familiarity shaped what happened next. The day after the shooting, Officer Frank Rowicant was on his way to work when he noticed two men near a street intersection. One of them stood out immediately. Rowicant recognized Campbell from the photograph displayed inside the precinct, a reminder of how closely he had been watched even before the homicide. Rowicant stopped the men and detained Campbell along with David Green. Green was found carrying a .32 caliber handgun. Despite the proximity to the Mixon killing, the two men were not arrested for murder at that time. Police suspected them in connection with an auto parts theft, not the Lawton Street shooting. After a brief detention, both men were released. It was a missed opportunity that underscored the limits of circumstantial suspicion without witnesses willing to speak. That changed by the end of July. Campbell and Green were arrested again, this time directly for the murder of Luther Mixon. At the police station, investigators conducted a lineup. Otis McClure and his wife, who lived in the apartment directly beneath the numbers operation, were brought in to view the suspects. Both positively identified Campbell and Green as the men involved in the robbery. The third participant, Watson Brooks, was still on the run. His absence did not last long. In late August, FBI agents located Brooks in New York. He was taken into custody and extradited back to Detroit, where he appeared before a judge in September. By then, the case had taken a clear shape. Witness identifications connected the suspects to the scene. The robbery had survivors. The murder victim was known, named, and documented. The earlier police familiarity with Campbell, once informal, had now hardened into formal charges. Campbell and Green appeared in Recorder's Court as the legal process moved forward. What had begun as a street-level robbery now sat firmly inside the judicial system. The evidence, the witnesses, and the surviving victims all pointed in the same direction. For Chester Wheeler Campbell, the path was narrowing. The burglar who had spent years cycling through short sentences was now facing the full weight of a murder prosecution, with consequences far beyond anything he had known before. The trial that followed the Lawton Street murder ended quickly and decisively. In 1956, Chester Wheeler Campbell was convicted of first-degree murder for the killing of Luther Mixon. The sentence carried no ambiguity. He was sent to Michigan State Prison in Jackson, a facility already notorious for violence, racial tension, and the informal hierarchies that shaped inmate life. Campbell entered prison in his mid-20s as a convicted killer, a status that immediately separated him from the petty offenders he had once resembled. He would remain there for the next 13 years. During that time, he did not fade into the background. According to later law enforcement accounts and journalistic reporting, Campbell treated incarceration as preparation rather than punishment. Michigan State Prison functioned as a clearinghouse of criminal experience. Inmates traded information, techniques, and contacts. Campbell absorbed it. He studied how crimes were organized, how investigations were avoided, and how influence was maintained even from behind bars. By the time he was released, authorities believed he had refined skills far beyond burglary or street robbery. There is no record of Campbell expressing remorse during this period and no indication that prison altered his direction. Instead, his reputation grew. Other inmates recognized him as a man willing to use violence, a trait that carried weight inside Jackson Prison. That reputation followed him after release, even though he had no new convictions during his incarceration. While Campbell served his sentence, Detroit changed. The city entered a period of social upheaval, economic decline, and rising narcotics trafficking. Organized crime structures shifted, and new opportunities emerged for men capable of operating in unstable environments. Campbell would re-enter that world at a moment when violence was becoming currency. By 1969, legal circumstances gave him an opening. His conviction was challenged, and the possibility of a new trial forced the court to reconsider the case. After 13 years inside Michigan State Prison, Campbell stood on the edge of freedom, carrying with him not rehabilitation, but a deeper understanding of how criminal power worked. When he walked out, the man who returned to Detroit was not the burglar who had entered prison in 1956. He was something more calculated, more dangerous, and far more prepared than before. When Chester Wheeler Campbell returned to Detroit in the fall of 1969, he stepped into a city that was already tearing at the seams. The underworld he had left behind no longer revolved around small-time gambling and neighborhood rackets. Narcotics had taken over, and with them came instability, shifting alliances, and an appetite for violence that rewarded men willing to enforce it. Campbell did not ease back into civilian life. Within weeks of his release, law enforcement began to hear his name again, not in connection with burglaries, but in homicide investigations tied to the drug trade. He quickly developed a reputation that traveled faster than any court filing. On the street and among police, he became known as Dr. Death and the Undertaker, nicknames that reflected how often his name surfaced after bodies were found. Authorities believed Campbell aligned himself with drug factions that maintained working relationships with the Italian mafia. According to historian Scott Bernstein, Campbell operated on the east side of Detroit and was connected to one of the last black street crews that worked directly for Italian organized crime figures. This group would later be referred to as the Murder Row Black Mafia organization, functioning as a violent subunit tied to the Giacalone crew within the Tocco Zerilli crime family. Campbell's role during this period was never established through a murder conviction, but police consistently viewed him as an enforcer and contract killer. His name appeared in case files tied to execution-style shootings, retaliatory killings, and drug-related disputes. Investigators believed he moved easily between crews, operating where interests overlapped and violence needed to be precise. He also adopted aliases to stay mobile and obscure his trail. One of the names later recovered by police was Augustus Miller, used during the early 1970s. It was a practical move in a city where surveillance was growing and loyalties shifted quickly. Detroit itself was in transition. The older mafia leadership was aging out while a new generation asserted control. At the same time, African-American drug organizations were breaking away from subordinate roles, demanding autonomy and profit. That collision created what police described as a dope war, and men like Campbell thrived in the chaos. Within a month of his release, Campbell was already considered a suspect in a double homicide investigation, a signal of how rapidly he had reinserted himself into violent circles. Nothing stuck in court, no charges held, but inside law enforcement, his name became a constant presence. By the early 1970s, Chester Wheeler Campbell was no longer viewed as a former inmate rebuilding his life. He was regarded as a professional criminal operating in a city where murder investigations piled up faster than convictions, and where reputation often carried more weight than evidence. Between 1970 and 1974, Chester Wheeler Campbell's name became embedded in Detroit homicide files, even as formal charges continued to fall short. This was the period when his reputation hardened, built not on convictions, but on proximity to violence and the consistency with which his name surfaced after killings tied to narcotics disputes. One of the most serious investigations came in November, shortly after his release. Police suspected Campbell, along with Watson Brooks and reputed heroin trafficker John Klassen, in the double murder of Jimmy Davis and his girlfriend Lisa. The couple had been sitting inside a parked car when they were shot in the head, execution style. Davis was not an anonymous victim. He had served as a protected witness in cases against drug dealers, including Klassen. That status immediately elevated the killing from street violence to an apparent silencing. No arrests followed, no charges stuck. But inside law enforcement, the belief was clear. Campbell was viewed as a likely triggerman, someone trusted to carry out high-risk jobs with permanent consequences. During these years, Campbell was believed to be aligned with Murder Row, a violent Blackstreet crew operating as a subcontractor for Italian organized crime interests. According to historians and prosecutors, the group functioned as an enforcement arm connected to the Giacalone crew of the Tocco Zerilli crime family. Murder Row expanded beyond the East Side, operating citywide and maintaining a base at the Michigan Federated Democratic Social Club in Midtown. Campbell's value to these networks was rooted in discretion and follow-through. He did not seek visibility. He moved through overlapping criminal circles, navigating relationships between drug dealers, mob figures, and corrupt officials. Law enforcement believed he understood how to exploit fractured jurisdictions and compromised oversight. At the same time, Detroit was being consumed by a broader crisis. Narcotics trafficking flourished, and with it came allegations of widespread corruption. Investigators later referred to aspects of this era as the Pingree Conspiracy, a tangle of bribes, protection, and compromised cases involving law enforcement and drug dealers. Homicide investigations stalled, evidence disappeared, witnesses backed away. Campbell thrived in that environment. From the perspective of police, he was shielded not by luck alone, but by a system struggling under its own corruption. He was questioned, watched, and suspected, yet remained untouched by murder convictions. By 1974, Campbell had become a constant presence in the background of Detroit's drug war. His name carried weight on the street and frustration inside police departments. He was viewed as a professional operating in a city where accountability was inconsistent and violence often went unanswered. What law enforcement did not yet realize was that Campbell himself was keeping records, and those records would soon bring everything crashing down. On the afternoon of February the 6th, 1975, Chester Wheeler Campbell's long run of avoiding serious consequences came to an abrupt halt in an unlikely place. He was driving through Orchard Lake, Michigan, an affluent suburb far removed from the neighborhoods where his reputation had been built, when he nearly collided head-on with a patrol car. The near crash was enough to justify a stop. What the officer encountered went far beyond a routine traffic matter. Inside Campbell's vehicle, police found weapons, drugs, and large amounts of cash. The discovery immediately escalated the situation, and Campbell was taken into custody. What followed mattered more than what was found in the car. When investigators searched Campbell's Detroit residence and his girlfriend's home in Orchard Lake, they uncovered a collection of material that stunned seasoned officers. Alongside guns, narcotics, and money were documents that read like an intelligence archive. Campbell had compiled names, addresses, phone numbers, and personal details of police officers, judges, prosecutors, politicians, gangsters, informants, addicts, and witnesses. Some of the material included sealed grand jury documents that should never have been in civilian hands. The scope of what he possessed suggested long-term surveillance and careful record-keeping. Campbell maintained notes on criminal cases, tracked law enforcement activity, and stored information in a way that implied both paranoia and preparation. Police also recovered espionage equipment, reinforcing the belief that he gathered intelligence as deliberately as others gathered weapons. Investigators later estimated that approximately $250,000 in cash had been seized across the searches. The money was scattered, not hidden in a single stash, found in vehicles, rooms, and containers, suggesting constant mobility rather than long-term storage. For the first time, authorities were not looking at Campbell as a suspect in isolated crimes. They were looking at him as a man sitting at the center of a web that connected criminals and officials across Detroit and its suburbs. The implications were immediate. Jurisdictions began to argue over control of the evidence. Multiple law enforcement agencies moved in parallel, each aware that the documents Campbell possessed could expose corruption well beyond his own case. Inside his jail cell, Campbell understood the danger. According to later reporting, he told another inmate that he was a dead man, whether he stayed locked up or walked free. The papers he had collected were leverage, but they were also a liability. The Orchard Lake traffic stop did not merely end a drive. It exposed a hidden record of Detroit's underworld and its compromised institutions, and it marked the moment when Chester Wheeler Campbell became as dangerous to the system as the system believed he had been to the streets. The fallout from the Orchard Lake stop did not move through the courts in a straight line. It detonated outward, touching police departments, prosecutors' offices, and political institutions across Detroit and Oakland County. From 1975 into the early 1980s, Chester Wheeler Campbell sat in custody while the system struggled to contain what his notebooks and documents threatened to expose. The material seized from Campbell's car and residences triggered immediate concern inside law enforcement. Agencies argued over jurisdiction, control of evidence, and access to what many believed was a trove of damaging intelligence. The Detroit Free Press reported that multiple departments viewed the documents as a potential bonanza, not only for criminal prosecutions, but for uncovering corruption that had long been rumored and rarely proven. Several murder cases pending against Campbell began to unravel. Witnesses disappeared or refused to cooperate. Evidence stalled. One of the most chilling moments came with the death of James Lee Newton, known as Watusi Slim. Newton was a local gangster and a key witness expected to testify against Campbell in connection with the 1972 murder of Roy Parsons. While in custody, Newton was found dead with his throat cut and X marks carved into his eyelids. The killing sent a clear message. Campbell's attorney later told a judge that his client did not need to be physically present to conduct business. From behind bars, Campbell remained active. He wrote dozens of letters and legal filings, attacking prosecutors, investigators, and officials by name. He paid particular attention to the money seized during the 1975 searches, estimated at roughly $250,000. Regaining control of that cash became a central obsession, pursued through years of litigation. The legal battles that followed were dense and slow. Courts ruled that the seizure of the money had exceeded the scope of the search warrant. State and federal tax authorities intervened with jeopardy assessments. Appeals stacked up. At one point, an appeals court ruled in Campbell's favor and ordered the money returned, only for the funds to remain tied up after being transferred to the Internal Revenue Service. As the years passed, the broader prosecutions collapsed. Murder charges were dropped. Conspiracy cases lost momentum. The corruption that Campbell's documents hinted at proved too sprawling and politically dangerous to resolve cleanly. What remained were weapons, drug, and habitual offender charges, easier to prove and safer to pursue. By the early 1980s, the Firestorm had burned itself down to embers. The system had survived, but it had done so by narrowing its focus. Campbell was no longer the centerpiece of a corruption scandal. He was a problem to be managed, contained, and eventually buried under sentences unrelated to the killings that had made his name. What the notebooks ultimately achieved was not reform, but exposure without resolution. And for Chester Wheeler Campbell, they ensured that whatever freedom he briefly regained would never last. When Chester Wheeler Campbell was paroled in September 1984, the release did not mark a return to freedom in any meaningful sense. It marked exposure. After years of legal battles, dropped cases, and quiet survival behind bars, he stepped back into a world filled with enemies, grudges, and unfinished business. Within months, the consequences arrived. In April 1985, Campbell was ambushed and shot multiple times in the leg and thigh. He survived, but the attack was serious enough to require an 11-hour surgical operation. The message was unmistakable. Whatever protection his reputation once provided had limits. When reporters later asked him about the shooting, Campbell offered no insight. He told them he had nothing newsworthy to say. The attempt on his life did not push him toward caution. By 1987, Campbell was once again in possession of weapons, narcotics, explosives, and surveillance equipment. The arrest echoed the Orchard Lake stop from 12 years earlier, but this time the tolerance had evaporated. Authorities no longer saw him as a corruption risk that might destabilize cases. He was now a habitual offender with a long record and no plausible path toward rehabilitation. Courts moved decisively. Campbell received a 40-year sentence, a punishment that reflected not just the immediate charges, but his history. The law no longer treated him as a suspect orbiting unresolved homicides. It treated him as a man who would not stop re-offending. This time there would be no retrial, no plea reduction, and no parole window waiting years down the line. The sentence effectively ended his presence on the street. The violence, the documents, the leverage, and the reputation no longer mattered. By the end of 1987, Chester Wheeler Campbell had been removed from circulation permanently. The system that had once struggled to contain him had chosen finality over uncertainty. What remained was a man aging inside federal custody, stripped of influence, waiting out the last chapter of a life shaped entirely by crime. The final years of Chester Wheeler unfolded far from the streets that had defined his reputation. After his 1987 conviction, he was placed in federal custody, where his remaining influence disappeared behind concrete walls, controlled movement, and medical supervision. The man once suspected of shaping violence across Detroit now lived under constant observation, his world reduced to routines dictated by the Bureau of Prisons. As his health declined, Campbell was transferred to a federal prison medical facility. Records show that his condition worsened steadily. Years of incarceration, substance exposure, and untreated illness took their toll. He was diagnosed with hepatitis C, a disease common among long-term inmates from his era, and his liver function continued to deteriorate. Unlike earlier chapters of his life, these years were not marked by legal maneuvering or attempts to reassert control. There were no further arrests, no recovered notebooks, and no remaining leverage. Campbell did not return to court in any meaningful way. He did not regain public attention. His name faded from headlines and case files alike. In 2001, Chester Wheeler Campbell died in federal custody. The cause of death was listed as end-stage liver disease resulting from hepatitis C. There was no controversy surrounding the finding, no unanswered questions, no signs of foul play. The conclusion of his life was quiet, clinical, and final. A man once feared as Dr. Death did not meet a violent end. He died as an inmate, under medical care. His story already written in court transcripts, police files, and investigative reporting. What remains is not legend, but record. One murder conviction, years of suspicion, a system strained by corruption and failure, and a life that moved steadily from petty crime to irreversible consequence, ending not with spectacle, but with silence.